The surveillance footage played revealing Dustin James executing two innocent people at a Miami 7-Eleven with a disturbing lack of emotion. What began as a convenience store robbery transformed into a double murder case that would shock the seasoned detectives of Miami's Violent Crimes Unit to their core. The damning surveillance footage captured every moment of the killer's actions, movements, and expressions, irrefutable evidence that would ultimately send a man to death row. On the night of July 17th, two innocent people, store clerk Gabriela Sanchez and customer Carlos Rodriguez, were brutally murdered during what appeared to be a robbery at a 7-Eleven convenience store in Miami, Florida. The perpetrator, later identified as 26-year-old Dustin James, entered the store at 11:47 p.m., casually browsing the aisles before approaching the counter with a drink and asking for cigarettes. What happened next was captured in horrifying clarity by the store's surveillance system. James produced a 9mm handgun and, without hesitation, shot Gabriela Sanchez twice in the chest before turning and firing a single shot into the head of Carlos Rodriguez, who had been standing at the coffee station with his back turned. The entire incident took less than 40 seconds, with James taking the time to empty the register of $217 before exiting, leaving behind two bodies and families that would never be the same. Miami, with its pristine beaches and glamorous nightlife, has always maintained a precarious balance between paradise and peril. The particular 7-Eleven where the murders occurred was situated on the edge of one of the city's working-class neighborhoods, a 24-hour lifeline for night shift workers, and a regular stop for locals seeking late-night necessities. The store's bright fluorescent lighting created a beacon in the darkness, visible from the nearby highway, and offering a sense of safety to those who frequented it in the overnight hours. That sense of safety was shattered on that July night, transforming a mundane corner of Miami's urban landscape into a scene of unimaginable horror. The surveillance footage would later become the cornerstone of the case against Dustin James, capturing not just the brutal act itself, but a wealth of details that would prove crucial to investigators. Every angle of the store was covered by high-definition cameras, providing clear images of James's face, his distinctive snake tattoo winding up his right forearm, and even the license plate of his vehicle parked directly outside. The clinical detachment with which he executed his victims was perhaps the most disturbing element of the footage. There was no rage, no emotion, just the methodical actions of someone who had mentally rehearsed this moment and was now simply going through the motions. This calculated approach would later factor heavily into the prosecution's argument for premeditation and the ultimate sentence handed down by the court. What made the case particularly chilling to Miami residents was the random nature of the victim selection. Neither Gabriela nor Carlos had any connection to James, and there was no evidence of any previous interaction between them. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their lives ended by a stranger who decided, for reasons initially unknown, that this would be the night he would take human life. The randomness of the act sent shockwaves through the community, with local news coverage focusing on the senseless nature of the crime, and the question that haunted everyone: could it have been me? The vibrant Miami neighborhood, normally alive with the sounds of music and laughter even late into the night, fell uncharacteristically quiet in the days following the murders, as residents processed their grief and fear. The morning after the murders, the 7-Eleven remained cordoned off with police tape. The normally bustling parking lot filled instead with law enforcement vehicles and news vans. Detective Zachary Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of Miami's Homicide Division, arrived on scene at 7 a.m. to take lead on the investigation, having been called in specifically for his expertise in surveillance analysis. The Miami sun beat down mercilessly as Mitchell ducked under the police tape, the humidity already oppressive despite the early hour. Inside the store, the clinical efficiency of the forensics team contrasted sharply with the chaos they were documenting. Blood spatter analysis, bullet trajectory mapping, and the careful collection of shell casings, all conducted with the precision that violent death paradoxically demands. "This isn't a robbery gone wrong," Mitchell commented to his partner as they watched the surveillance footage for the third time in the manager's back office. "The way he handles himself, the lack of hesitation, this guy came in here with the intention of killing someone." The high-quality digital footage showed James entering the store at 11:47 p.m., his baseball cap pulled low but not enough to obscure his face from the overhead cameras. He spent several minutes walking the aisles, occasionally glancing at the clerk and the sole customer in the store, before selecting a bottled water from the refrigerated section. What stood out to the detectives was how James positioned himself during this browsing period, always maintaining sightlines to both the front door and the two victims, as if ensuring no additional variables would enter the equation. The most disturbing aspect of the footage came after James had fired the shots and both victims lay motionless on the store's linoleum floor. Rather than immediately fleeing, he took his time at the register, methodically removing cash and placing it in his pocket. He then calmly walked to the front door, pausing to take a candy bar from a display before exiting at 11:51 p.m., 4 minutes after he had entered. Detective Mitchell had investigated hundreds of homicides during his career with the Miami Police Department, but something about the cold calculation displayed in the surveillance footage sent a chill through him, despite the sweltering Florida heat. "We need to identify this guy immediately," he told the assembled team as the video ended. "Everything about this tells me he's done this before or will do it again." By noon, the technical team had isolated and enhanced several clear images of the perpetrator's face from the surveillance footage, and these were distributed to all law enforcement agencies in Miami-Dade County. The distinctive snake tattoo on James's forearm was particularly notable, as it appeared to be custom work rather than a standard design from a flash sheet. Detective Mitchell also ordered enhancement of the exterior camera footage, which had captured a partial license plate number from James's sedan. Miami's reputation as a tourist destination and transient community made identification potentially challenging, but the quality of the evidence gave the investigation team a significant advantage from the outset. "We've got his face, his car, and his tattoo," Mitchell told the police chief during their midday briefing. "With this surveillance footage, it's not a question of if we'll identify him, but when." Gabriela Sanchez was 24 years old when her life ended on the cold floor of a Miami 7-Eleven, her white store uniform stained crimson from 2 bullet wounds to the chest. Born to Cuban immigrants who had arrived in Miami in the late 1990s, Gabriela had been working the overnight shift at the convenience store for just over 2 years to pay her way through nursing school at Miami-Dade College. Her professors described her as diligent and compassionate, qualities that would have made her an excellent nurse had she been given the chance to complete her degree. According to her mother, Elena Sanchez, Gabriela had been scheduled to graduate the following spring and had already been offered a position at Jackson Memorial Hospital, where she had been completing her clinical rotations. She wanted to work in the pediatric ward, Elena Sanchez explained, through tears during a press conference held 3 days after the murder, the Miami sunlight catching the gold cross around her neck as she spoke of her daughter's dreams. Ever since she was a little girl, Gabby wanted to help children. She said their resilience inspired her, and she wanted to be part of their healing. The Sanchez family had moved to the Little Havana neighborhood when Gabriela was just 4 years old, becoming integral members of their community through their involvement with their local church and Gabriela's father's popular Cuban bakery. Gabriela had grown up surrounded by extended family music and the rich aromas of her cultural heritage, developing into a young woman who embodied the vibrant spirit of her Miami community. Her younger brother, Miguel, shared during the vigil held outside the 7-Eleven that Gabriela had been saving money not just for school, but to take their parents on a surprise trip to Cuba. She wanted them to see their homeland again, to reconnect with the family they left behind, he said, his voice breaking as hundreds of candles illuminated the parking lot where, just days before, his sister had parked for her final shift. Friends from school spoke of Gabriela's determination and her ability to maintain a positive outlook despite working full-time while attending classes, often functioning on just a few hours of sleep, yet never complaining about her demanding schedule. The image that emerged was of a young woman deeply invested in building a future for herself and bringing pride to the family that had sacrificed so much for her opportunities. Carlos Rodriguez, the second victim of James's senseless violence, had stopped at the 7-Eleven for coffee on his way to his overnight security position at Mercy Hospital. At 35, the father of 3 had been working as a hospital security guard for 7 years, a job he had taken after completing 2 tours of duty with the U.S. Army in Afghanistan. His wife, Maria, described him as a devoted father who coached his son's Little League team and never missed his daughter's dance recitals, despite his demanding schedule. Carlos would sleep just a few hours after his shift to be present for the kids, Maria explained to Detective Mitchell during her interview. He said he had missed too much while deployed and wasn't going to miss any more of their childhood. The Rodriguez family lived in a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Miami, the kind of place where neighbors still knew each other's names and children played in front yards until sunset. Carlos had been pursuing an associate's degree in criminal justice through online courses, with aspirations of joining the Miami Police Department once his youngest child started school. His colleagues at Mercy Hospital established a memorial fund for the family within days of his death, and the hospital's administrative staff arranged for Maria to receive benefits equivalent to what would have been provided had Carlos died while on duty. The outpouring of support reflected how deeply Carlos had integrated himself into the hospital community, with doctors and nurses alike sharing stories of his friendly demeanor and willingness to go beyond the requirements of his job to help patients and staff. Both victims represented the heart of Miami's working class, immigrants or children of immigrants pursuing the American dream through education and honest work. The randomness with which their lives were taken struck a particularly painful chord in a city built by generations of people who had come to Florida's shores seeking opportunity and safety. Local news coverage emphasized this aspect of the tragedy, with one Miami Herald headline reading, "Dreams Deferred, Promising Futures, Cut Short by Senseless Violence." The growing memorial outside the 7-Eleven became a symbol of the community's collective grief, with messages in both English and Spanish expressing outrage, sorrow, and calls for justice. The impact of the double murder extended beyond the immediate families, creating ripples throughout Miami's tight-knit communities. Gabriela's nursing cohort at Miami-Dade College held a candlelight vigil on campus, where her empty seat in the classroom was adorned with white lilies and her unfinished class notes. Carlos's absence was felt acutely at Mercy Hospital, where staff reported a somber mood in the normally bustling institution as security protocols were reviewed and counseling was made available to employees processing the loss of their colleague. The 7-Eleven Corporation announced it would cover funeral expenses for both victims and was reviewing security measures at all Miami locations, though this corporate response did little to comfort those mourning the senseless loss of 2 beloved community members. Detective Mitchell made a point of personally visiting both families within the first 48 hours of the investigation, a practice he maintained despite the emotional toll it took. "I need to see who they were," he explained to his partner as they drove through Miami's palm-lined streets to the Rodriguez home. "Not just names in a case file, but real people with lives that mattered. The detectives spent hours with each family, collecting photographs and stories that would later prove invaluable in humanizing the victims during the trial. He learned that Gabriela collected vintage postcards from Florida's early tourism days and that Carlos had meticulously restored a 1967 Mustang that he hoped to one day pass down to his oldest son. These details, these glimpses into lives prematurely ended, fueled Mitchell's determination to build an airtight case against the man captured so clearly on the surveillance footage. The 911 call came in at 11:57 p.m., the panicked voice of a college student who had stopped for energy drinks before an all-night study session, only to discover a scene of carnage inside the normally quiet 7-Eleven. "There's blood everywhere," the caller, identified later as 19-year-old Trevor Mason, told the dispatcher, his voice cracking as he described seeing two bodies on the floor behind the counter and near the coffee station. The Miami-Dade Emergency Response System immediately dispatched police and paramedics to the location, with the first patrol car arriving at 11:59 p.m., a remarkably quick response time that would unfortunately make no difference to the victims who had been dead for approximately 10 minutes. The responding officers secured the scene and confirmed the deaths of Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez before requesting homicide detectives and a forensic team, setting in motion the investigative machinery that would eventually lead to Dustin James' arrest and conviction. The crime scene presented a grim tableau under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the convenience store. The white linoleum floor stained with expanding pools of blood that reflected the overhead lights like dark mirrors. Officer Ramon Diaz, the first to enter the store, would later testify about the eerie stillness that greeted him, the refrigeration units humming steadily, a pop radio station playing cheerful summer hits, and the two victims lying motionless amid the mundane products of everyday life. Digital evidence technicians were called in immediately upon discovery of the store's sophisticated surveillance system, a recent installation that the franchise owner had implemented just 3 months earlier, following a series of nonviolent shoplifting incidents. The system's high-definition cameras covered every angle of the small store, including the exterior parking area and entrance, providing investigators with an unprecedented view of a double homicide from multiple perspectives. Detective Zachary Mitchell arrived at the scene at 12:35 a.m., having been called from home due to the high-profile nature of the case. A double homicide in a public location warranted immediate attention from the department's most experienced investigators. Mitchell's 15 years with Miami's Homicide Division had given him a reputation for thoroughness and an almost uncanny ability to extract information from digital evidence, skills that would prove crucial in the hours and days ahead. His first action upon arriving was to review the surveillance footage, working with the store's manager, who had also been called to the scene to provide access to the security system's password-protected files. What Mitchell saw in that back office, hunched over a computer monitor as the night deepened outside, was one of the clearest recordings of a homicide he had encountered in his entire career. The foundational clue in this entire case is the surveillance footage, Mitchell explained to the assembled investigative team during their first briefing at 3 a.m. The Miami police station's fluorescent lights creating harsh shadows across tired faces. The footage showed the entire sequence of events in merciless detail. Dustin James entering the store, his casual browsing of the aisles, the moment he approached the counter, and the horrifying seconds when he drew his weapon and fired without hesitation or apparent emotion. "What we have here is essentially a filmed confession," Mitchell continued, his normally stoic demeanor betraying hints of the anger he felt watching the callous taking of 2 lives. "Our job now is to identify this individual and build a case that ensures he never has the opportunity to do this again." The technical team began working immediately to enhance key frames from the video, focusing particularly on the perpetrator's face, the distinctive snake, tattoo visible on his right forearm when he raised the gun, and the partial license plate captured by the external camera as he drove away. Miami's humid climate had fogged the exterior camera slightly, but skilled technicians were able to clean up the image enough to identify the first 4 characters of James's license plate. The team also isolated audio from the surveillance system, though it provided limited additional information. James had spoken only to request cigarettes from Gabriela before drawing his weapon, and the victims had no time to speak before they were shot. The clinical efficiency with which the killer had executed the murders suggested to Mitchell a level of planning or previous experience that elevated the threat level of the case. While the technical analysis continued, other members of the investigative team conducted a thorough processing of the physical crime scene. Blood spatter analysis confirmed the sequence of events shown in the video, with Gabriela shot first at close range behind the counter, followed by Carlos, who had been standing with his back turned at the coffee station approximately 15 feet away. 2 9mm shell casings were recovered, along with the bullets themselves, one lodged in the wall behind where Gabriela had stood, the other recovered during Carlos's autopsy later that day. The cash register showed a deficit of approximately $217 when compared to the expected amount, based on the day's sales records, though Detective Mitchell noted in his report that the theft appeared almost incidental to the murders rather than the primary motivation. By dawn, the investigation had already made significant progress, with the surveillance footage serving as the central pillar around which all other evidence was organized. The Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner arrived at 6:30 a.m. to formally pronounce the victims dead and supervise the removal of their bodies for autopsy. Dr. Elaine Cortez, the chief medical examiner assigned to the case, performed preliminary examinations at the scene, confirming that both victims had died almost instantly from their wounds. "The shot placement indicates someone who knew exactly what they were doing," she commented to Detective Mitchell as the bodies were carefully placed in transport bags. "These aren't wild or emotional shots. They're precisely targeted to ensure maximum damage to vital organs." The morning brought a shift change for the investigation team, but no slowing of momentum as the case garnered immediate attention from both local and national media. Miami, with its complex relationship with violent crime, elevated during the cocaine wars of the 1980s but significantly reduced in recent decades, still reacted with shock to such a brazen and seemingly unmotivated double homicide. By 8 a.m., enhanced images from the surveillance footage had been distributed to all law enforcement agencies in the county, and Detective Mitchell had authorized their release to the media by mid-morning. The decision to make the perpetrator's face public came with the approval of the district attorney's office, which recognized that rapid identification was crucial given the apparently random nature of the killings and the possibility of additional violence. The surveillance footage quickly became the most viewed video in South Florida, broadcast repeatedly on local news stations, and shared widely across social media platforms. The clarity of the images led to an immediate flood of tips to the Miami Police Department's hotline, though many were quickly dismissed as either mistaken identifications or attempts to settle personal scores through false reports. However, by late afternoon of the first day, 3 separate credible tips had identified the man in the footage as Dustin James, a 26-year-old Miami resident with a sparse but concerning criminal record that included 1 arrest for assault that had been pleaded down to a misdemeanor 3 years earlier. The most compelling identification came from James's former employer, the manager of a marina, who recognized both his face and the distinctive snake tattoo that had been the subject of workplace conversations. By the evening of July 18th, just 24 hours after the murders, Detective Zachary Mitchell had a name for the man in the surveillance footage, Dustin James. The tip from James's former employer at Ocean Blue Marina proved particularly valuable, as it included not just an identification, but additional information about James's personality, habits, and last known address. He worked for me for about 8 months last year, Marina manager Thomas Grant told detectives during his formal interview. Always punctual, good with boats, but there was something off about him, the way he would watch people, almost studying them. Grant explained that he had terminated James's employment after an incident with a customer, describing how James had responded to a wealthy boat owner's criticism with such cold intensity that Grant feared the situation would escalate to violence. The Marina employment records provided investigators with James's Social Security number, which allowed them to quickly build a profile of the suspect. Born in Cleveland, Ohio, James had moved to Miami 5 years earlier, working a series of jobs in the service and maritime industries, without establishing a long-term employment history anywhere. His criminal record was surprisingly sparse for someone capable of such calculated violence, a single arrest for assault after a bar fight 3 years earlier that had been pleaded down to disorderly conduct, resulting in probation that he had completed without incident. This relative lack of criminal history initially puzzled Mitchell until further investigation revealed that James had lived in 3 different states over the previous decade, raising the possibility of similar incidents that hadn't yet been connected across jurisdictional boundaries. The surveillance footage provided investigators with another crucial advantage: a partial license plate and clear images of James's vehicle, identified as a 2015 silver Honda Accord. By cross-referencing the partial plate information with Florida DMV records for silver Accords registered in Miami-Dade County, analysts were able to identify James's full license plate by early morning on July 19th. The Miami Police Department immediately issued an alert for the vehicle, which was spotted just hours later by a patrol officer in the North Beach area, parked outside a small apartment complex where James was renting a 1-bedroom unit. Rather than moving immediately to arrest, Detective Mitchell ordered surveillance of the location, concerned about the potential for violence given what they had witnessed on the convenience store footage. "We're dealing with someone who has demonstrated both the willingness and ability to kill without hesitation," Mitchell explained during the tactical briefing before the surveillance operation began. "I want eyes on this location, 24/7. But no approach until we have sufficient personnel and a solid tactical plan." The detective's caution was informed not just by the surveillance footage from the 7-Eleven, but by additional information that had emerged about James during the investigation's first 48 hours. A former roommate, located through rental records, described James as intensely private, and mentioned finding a journal containing disturbing fantasies about power and control, though he had never reported these concerns to authorities. This insight into James's psychology, combined with the methodical nature of the killings, suggested to Mitchell that their suspect might resist arrest or even attempt suicide by cop if cornered. The surveillance team established positions around James's apartment building by mid-afternoon on July 19th, utilizing unmarked vehicles and plainclothes officers to avoid detection. Technical specialists from the department set up remote monitoring equipment that allowed them to detect movement within the apartment while maintaining a safe distance. The first visual confirmation of James came at 7:23 p.m. when he returned to his apartment carrying takeout food, his appearance matching perfectly with the images from the 7-Eleven surveillance footage. The snake tattoo was clearly visible as he rolled up his sleeves in the Miami heat, removing any doubt that they had located the right individual. Over the next 12 hours, the surveillance team observed James's movements, noting that he appeared to be following news coverage of the murders on both television and internet sources. "He's watching himself on TV," reported one surveillance officer as James turned up the volume on his television during a news segment featuring the enhanced images from the convenience store. Cameras. Of particular concern to Detective Mitchell was the observation that James appeared to be organizing his belongings and checking bus schedules online, suggesting he might be planning to flee the jurisdiction. This development accelerated the timeline for arrest, with Mitchell securing an emergency warrant based on the surveillance footage, identification, and the imminent risk of flight. The arrest operation was planned for dawn on July 20th, just 60 hours after the murders. SWAT team members took position around the apartment complex at 4:30 a.m., with negotiators and medical personnel on standby given the high-risk nature of the apprehension. The tactical plan involved a coordinated approach from multiple angles to minimize the risk of escape or violent confrontation. At 5:12 a.m., after confirming that James was alone in the apartment and likely asleep, the SWAT team executed a dynamic entry, breaching the door with a battering ram and deploying flashbang grenades to disorient the suspect before he could reach for any weapons. The effectiveness of the tactical approach became immediately apparent when James was apprehended without resistance, taken by surprise, as he was handcuffed while still in bed. "I've been expecting you," were his first words to the arresting officers, a chillingly calm statement that would later be cited during his trial as evidence of his awareness of guilt. A search of the apartment conducted immediately after the arrest yielded significant evidence. The clothing James had worn during the murders was found in a garbage bag, apparently awaiting disposal. A 9mm handgun matching the ballistics of the murder weapon was located in a kitchen drawer. And perhaps most disturbing, a laptop containing bookmarked news articles about the killings and multiple replays of the surveillance footage that had been released to the media. James was transported to the Miami-Dade Police Headquarters, where Detective Mitchell was waiting to conduct the initial interrogation. The suspect was processed according to standard procedures, photographed, fingerprinted, and read his Miranda rights, which he acknowledged understanding before agreeing to speak with investigators without an attorney present. This decision, which legal experts would later debate during the trial, provided the prosecution with additional damning evidence as James responded to questions with a detachment that bordered on indifference. Mitchell, with his years of experience interviewing homicide suspects, was struck by James's complete lack of the usual defensive mechanisms or emotional responses. The interrogation room where Mitchell faced James was deliberately Spartan, a metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, and a one-way observation mirror being the only features aside from the video recording equipment mounted in the upper corners. The Miami summer heat had penetrated even this windowless interior room, creating a physical discomfort that Mitchell hoped might work to his advantage during questioning. James, however, showed no signs of distress, maintaining a posture of relaxed attention as the detective organized his materials, including a laptop containing the 7-Eleven surveillance footage that would serve as the centerpiece of the interview strategy. "I'm going to show you something, Dustin, and I'd like you to tell me what you see," Mitchell began, turning the laptop to face James and playing the footage of the double murder. Most suspects, when confronted with video evidence of their crimes, would attempt to deny, justify, or minimize their actions. But James watched the footage with an expression of mild interest, as if observing a nature documentary rather than his own acts of lethal violence. When the video concluded with James calmly exiting the store after taking a candy bar, Mitchell leaned forward and asked directly, "Is that you in the video?" James's response, delivered without hesitation or apparent concern, would become one of the most quoted statements in the subsequent trial. "Of course it's me. Why else would I be sitting here?" The case against Dustin James began with the surveillance footage as its foundation, but quickly expanded as forensic evidence and investigative work filled in the picture of what had occurred before, during, and after the murders at the Miami 7-Eleven. In the days following James's arrest, the Miami-Dade Crime Lab processed the 9mm handgun recovered from his apartment, confirming through ballistics testing that it was indeed the weapon used to kill both Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez. The gun, a Glock 17, had been purchased legally by James 3 months earlier from a licensed dealer in Miami, with all proper background checks completed and paperwork in order, a fact that would later contribute to discussions about gun control legislation in Florida. Forensic analysts also found gunshot residue on the clothing recovered from James's apartment, and DNA testing confirmed the presence of blood spatter from both victims on the shoes he had worn during the crime. Digital forensics proved equally valuable in building the case against James, with analysts recovering search history from his laptop that revealed a disturbing pattern of research in the weeks leading up to the murders. James had conducted multiple searches for topics including security camera blind spots in convenience stores, how police trace bullets to guns, and perhaps most disturbingly, what does it feel like to kill someone? His browser history showed that he had specifically researched the 7-Eleven location where the murders occurred, looking at street view images and even checking the store's hours of operation. Cell phone data obtained through a secondary warrant provided location information that placed James's phone at the murder scene at the exact time shown in the surveillance footage, as well as evidence that he had driven by the location on 3 separate occasions in the week before the killings, suggesting a level of planning and premeditation that would become central to the prosecution's case. Assistant District Attorney Amanda Walker, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for handling Miami's most high-profile violent crime cases, was assigned to lead the state's case against James. Walker immediately recognized the strength of the evidence but was concerned about establishing motive. While the surveillance footage clearly showed James committing the murders, it offered no insight into why he had chosen that particular store or those specific victims. Juries want to understand the why, she explained to Detective Mitchell during their first strategy meeting. Even with video evidence this clear, they'll be looking for some explanation of what would drive someone to commit such a senseless act. The detective nodded his agreement, having seen seemingly airtight cases complicated by the absence of a clear motive that jurors could comprehend. The breakthrough regarding motive came from an unexpected source. James's journal, recovered during a second, more thorough search of his apartment, authorized under an expanded warrant. The leather-bound notebook contained entries dating back 2 years, with increasingly disturbing content in the months leading up to the murders. James wrote extensively about feeling invisible in Miami's status-conscious social environment and described developing fantasies about making people see me, even if it's the last thing they ever see. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before the murders, contained a passage that prosecutors would later read aloud in court. "I walk past these places every day, convenience stores, coffee shops, gas stations. People look through me like I'm not there. What would it take for them to really see me, to remember my face for the rest of their lives? Some people become famous through achievement. I'm thinking there might be a more direct route." Further investigation into James's background revealed a pattern of social isolation and growing resentment that provided context for the journal entries. Interviews with former co-workers and acquaintances painted a picture of a man who struggled to form meaningful connections, often feeling slighted or overlooked in social and professional settings. James had moved to Miami with aspirations of breaking into the yacht industry, but after several failed attempts to secure positions with prestigious marinas, he had been reduced to taking whatever maritime work he could find, most recently the job at Ocean Blue Marina that had ended in termination. His landlord described him as forgettable, always paid rent on time but wouldn't recognize him if I passed him on the street, an ironic assessment given James's apparent desire to be remembered, even infamously. The forensic analysis of the surveillance footage itself became a crucial component in building the case, with experts using advanced techniques to extract additional details beyond what was immediately visible. Enhancement of the audio captured James's limited interaction with Gabriela Sanchez, confirming that he had asked for Marlboro cigarettes in a calm, conversational tone just seconds before drawing his weapon. Frame-by-frame analysis of his movements showed a level of preparation and awareness that prosecutors would argue demonstrated clear premeditation. James had positioned himself to maintain sightlines to both the entrance and the security camera locations, and he had waited until no other customers entered the store before initiating the robbery. Perhaps most damning was the enhanced footage showing James's facial expression after firing the shots, what one analyst described as a micro-expression of satisfaction that was visible for just a fraction of a second before his face returned to its previous mask of calm detachment. As the investigation continued, connections to other unsolved crimes began to emerge, though none with the same level of definitive evidence as the 7-Eleven case. Detectives from neighboring Broward County contacted Mitchell regarding an unsolved convenience store robbery from 4 months earlier, where the perpetrator's physical description and methodology shared similarities with James's approach. Though the earlier crime had not resulted in physical violence, the store clerk reported that the robber had displayed a level of intensity that had left her fearing for her life. The Broward case lacked the clear surveillance footage that defined the Miami murders, but investigators were able to establish that James had been living in the area at the time, and his cell phone had connected to towers near the location on the date in question. Assistant District Attorney Walker made the strategic decision to focus solely on the Miami double homicide rather than potentially complicating the case by attempting to link James to other crimes with less definitive evidence. "We have him on video committing 2 execution-style murders," she explained to the victims' families during a meeting 6 weeks after the killings. "With the surveillance footage as our cornerstone, plus the recovered weapon, DNA evidence, digital forensics, and his own statements during interrogation, we have more than enough to pursue the death penalty." Both families expressed support for this approach, with Carlos Rodriguez's widow stating simply, "We just want justice to be as swift and certain as possible." The final component in building the case against James came from psychiatric evaluation, conducted both by state-appointed experts and later by the defense team's specialists. Dr. Elaine Haraway, a forensic psychiatrist with extensive experience evaluating violent offenders, conducted a series of interviews with James while he awaited trial. Her assessment, which would be presented during the trial's penalty phase, described James as displaying significant traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, including a profound lack of empathy, failure to conform to social norms, and indifference to the suffering of others. Critically, Dr. Haraway found no evidence of any mental illness that would render James unable to distinguish right from wrong or understand the nature of his actions, effectively eliminating the possibility of an insanity defense. The strength of the case built against Dustin James was reflected in the formal charges brought by the state of Florida: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of armed robbery, and 1 count of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The notice of intent to seek the death penalty was filed 90 days after the murders, citing the particularly heinous nature of the crimes, the clear evidence of premeditation, and the fact that multiple victims were killed in a single criminal episode. By the time the case was presented to the grand jury for indictment, the prosecution had assembled what legal observers described as one of the most comprehensive murder cases in Florida's recent history, with the surveillance footage serving as the dramatic centerpiece of an evidence collection that left little room for reasonable doubt. Assistant District Attorney Walker prepared meticulously for trial, knowing that despite the overwhelming evidence, death penalty cases demanded absolute precision. She worked closely with the technical team to create a presentation of the surveillance footage that would be both technically accurate and emotionally impactful when shown to the jury. "This isn't just evidence," she told her team during a preparation session. "This is the moment when 12 citizens will watch a man take 2 innocent lives without provocation or remorse." The power of the footage, its clarity, its completeness, its unflinching documentation of James's actions, would become the prosecution's most compelling argument, a window into 4 minutes that changed forever the lives of the victims' families and would ultimately determine the fate of Dustin James. The pre-dawn arrest of Dustin James proceeded with a clinical efficiency that matched the methodical nature of his crimes. At 5:12 a.m. on July 20th, just 60 hours after the 7-Eleven murders, Miami-Dade SWAT officers breached the door of James's North Beach apartment with such speed and coordination that the suspect was in handcuffs before he fully registered what was happening. Officer Ricardo Vasquez, the team leader who first entered the bedroom, would later testify about the unsettling calm with which James responded to the armed officers surrounding his bed. "Most suspects show fear, anger, or confusion when we come through the door," Vasquez explained. During his court testimony, "James just looked at us like he'd been expecting company, and we were right on time." The apartment, a sparsely furnished one-bedroom unit in an aging, stucco building just blocks from the ocean, yielded immediate evidence connecting James to the murders. SWAT officers, trained to notice details even during dynamic entries, observed the clothes visible in a garbage bag, a blue polo shirt and khaki pants that matched what the killer had worn in the surveillance footage. A systematic search conducted after James was secured and removed from the premises revealed the murder weapon in a kitchen drawer, placed between cooking utensils as if it were just another household item. Detective Zachary Mitchell, who arrived at the apartment shortly after James had been transported to police headquarters, personally supervised the evidence collection, ensuring that every item was properly documented, photographed in place, and carefully preserved to maintain the chain of custody that would be crucial during trial. The 9mm Glock found in James's apartment was handled with particular care, collected by firearms specialist Officer Tamara Reynolds, who documented the weapon's condition, noting that it was loaded with a round in the chamber, ready to fire. "He wasn't planning on being taken peacefully if he'd had any warning," Mitchell commented, as the gun was secured in an evidence container. Other items recovered from the apartment included a laptop containing searches related to the murders, a collection of news articles about other homicide cases from around the country, and a journal that would later provide crucial insight into James's mindset leading up to the killings. The Miami-Dade evidence technicians worked meticulously throughout the morning, their movements careful and deliberate, in the knowledge that every item they collected was potentially building the case against a double murderer. While the evidence collection continued at his apartment, Dustin James sat in an interrogation room at Miami-Dade Police Headquarters, the harsh fluorescent lighting accentuating his impassive expression as he waited for questioning to begin. He had been processed according to standard procedures, photographed, fingerprinted, and provided with water and the opportunity to use the restroom, his rights under Miranda, explained clearly and acknowledged with a casual nod. Unlike many suspects who request an attorney immediately upon arrest, James agreed to speak with investigators, a decision that prosecutors would later suggest reflected his desire for an audience rather than any misconceived notion that he could talk his way out of the charges. Detective Mitchell entered the interrogation room at 8:45 a.m., carrying a laptop and a thin file folder that contained printouts from the surveillance footage. The detective had conducted hundreds of interrogations during his career with Miami's Homicide Division, developing a reputation for extracting confessions through a combination of strategic patience and psychological insight. With James, Mitchell chose an approach that differed from his usual methodology. Instead of building rapport or employing the common technique of suggesting he already knew everything and just needed confirmation, Mitchell opted for direct confrontation with the evidence, calculating that James's apparent desire for recognition might lead him to acknowledge his actions if presented with the undeniable proof of the surveillance footage. "I'm Detective Zachary Mitchell, Miami-Dade Homicide," he began, his voice measured and professional, as he took the seat across from James. "You've been advised of your rights, and you've agreed to speak with me without an attorney present. Is that correct?" James nodded, then added verbally, "Yes, that's correct," his voice betraying no anxiety despite the circumstances. Mitchell opened his laptop and turned it to face James, the screen showing a paused image from the 7-Eleven surveillance system, a crystal-clear frame capturing James entering the store at 11:47 p.m., 2 nights earlier. "I'm going to show you something, and I'd like you to tell me what you see," the detective said, pressing play and allowing the footage to run uninterrupted, showing the entirety of the double murder from multiple camera angles. Most suspects, when confronted with video evidence of their crimes, would attempt to deny their involvement or offer some explanation or justification. James did neither, watching the footage with an expression that Mitchell would later describe as mild interest, like someone watching a movie they've already seen. When the video concluded, showing James exiting the store with his stolen cash and candy bar, the detective closed the laptop and looked directly at the suspect. "Is that you in the video?" he asked simply. James maintained eye contact as he replied, "Of course it's me. Why else would I be sitting here?" The casualness of the admission, lacking any attempt at denial or evasion, momentarily caught Mitchell off guard despite his years of experience with homicide suspects. Recovering quickly, Mitchell pressed forward, asking James to walk him through what had happened that night. "I went to the store, I shot the clerk and the customer, I took the money, and I left," James responded, as if reciting a grocery list. "It's all there in your video." The detective, recognizing the unusual candor but determined to establish motive and premeditation, asked why James had chosen that particular store and those specific victims. James considered the question for several moments before responding with a statement that would feature prominently in news coverage and later in the prosecution's case. "I just wanted to know what it felt like. They weren't anyone special, just people who happened to be there when I decided to find out." The interrogation continued for nearly 3 hours, with James answering questions directly but with an emotional detachment that experienced law enforcement officers found disturbing. He described selecting the 7-Eleven after driving past it several times and, noting its isolated location and late-night hours, admitted to researching the store's layout online and acknowledged purchasing the gun specifically for the purpose of committing a violent crime. "I bought it legally," he noted, with what appeared to be a hint of irony. "Passed all the background checks." When Mitchell asked if he felt any remorse for taking 2 lives, James paused before responding, "I understand that I'm supposed to say yes to that question, but no, I don't feel anything about it one way or the other. They're just gone now." Throughout the interrogation, Detective Mitchell maintained his professional demeanor despite the growing sense of unease James's responses created. The detective had encountered various types of killers during his career, those who killed in passion, in panic, for profit, or for revenge. But James represented something different, a person who had taken lives out of curiosity, with neither emotional involvement nor apparent psychological compulsion. The surveillance footage had shown the physical reality of James's actions, but the interrogation revealed something the cameras couldn't capture, the profound absence of normal human empathy that had allowed him to commit such an act, and discuss it afterward with complete detachment. As the questioning continued, James provided details that corroborated what investigators had already gleaned from the evidence and added new information that would strengthen the case against him. He described his methodology with a precision that reinforced the premeditated nature of the crime, explaining how he had chosen to shoot Gabriela Sanchez first because she was behind the counter and could potentially have accessed an alarm, then immediately targeting Carlos Rodriguez to eliminate any witnesses. The tactical thinking behind these split-second decisions suggested to Mitchell a level of planning that went beyond a spontaneous act of violence, a conclusion that would feature prominently in the prosecution's argument for the death penalty. The most chilling moment of the interrogation came when Mitchell asked James if he had planned to kill more people that night. "If someone else had walked in, yes," James replied without hesitation. "I had 15 rounds in the magazine, and I only used 3. This casual acknowledgement of his willingness to take additional lives significantly elevated the case in the eyes of the prosecution, transforming it from a double murder that happened to be captured on video to what could have potentially been a mass casualty event, stopped only by the chance absence of more customers in the store that night. Assistant District Attorney Walker would later refer to this statement as evidence of the ongoing danger James would pose to society regardless of where or how he was confined. By the conclusion of the interrogation, James had provided a full confession consistent with the evidence already in police possession, and offering additional details that only the perpetrator could have known. He signed a written statement summarizing his admissions, again declining the opportunity to have legal representation present, despite Mitchell reminding him of this right multiple times during the process. The detective concluded the session by asking one final question that had been nagging at him throughout the interview. "Do you regret being caught?" James considered this for a moment before responding with the hint of a smile. "I regret that the cameras were so good, but at least now people will remember my name." The interrogation video, combined with the surveillance footage from the 7-Eleven, created an unusually complete documentation of both the crime itself and the perpetrator's state of mind, a prosecutor's dream in building a case for premeditated murder. When Detective Mitchell finally emerged from the interrogation room after nearly 4 hours, his colleagues noted the unusual tension in his normally imperturbable demeanor. "In 15 years working homicide, I've never interviewed anyone like him," Mitchell told his captain during their debriefing. "There's nothing there, no remorse, no fear, no anger, just this empty curiosity about what it feels like to kill someone." This assessment would be echoed by the psychiatric professionals who later evaluated James, with one forensic psychiatrist noting that he represented a textbook case of antisocial personality disorder with pronounced psychopathic traits. James was transferred to the Miami-Dade County Detention Center following his interrogation, placed in maximum security due to both the severity of his charges and the high-profile nature of the case. The surveillance footage from the 7-Eleven had been released to media outlets seeking to help identify the perpetrator, and by the time of James's arrest, the images of the double murder had been viewed by millions across Florida and beyond. Correctional officers reported that James appeared unbothered by his incarceration, adapting quickly to the routine and exhibiting none of the stress or anxiety common among newly arrested individuals facing potential capital punishment. One guard noted in the daily log that James seems almost pleased with the attention, an observation that aligned with the insights gained during his interrogation regarding his desire for recognition. The trial of Dustin James began on a sweltering Miami morning in February, 8 months after the 7-Eleven murders that had shocked the community and generated national headlines. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse, an imposing limestone building in the heart of downtown, was surrounded by media trucks and camera crews as the proceedings commenced, with journalists from across the country gathered to cover what many legal analysts were calling the most documented murder case in recent memory. Inside Courtroom 4B, a modern, wood-paneled space with capacity for approximately 100 spectators, every seat was filled. Family members of the victims occupied the front row, while members of the press and public filled the remaining spaces, all drawn by the notoriety of a case centered around crimes captured in their entirety on surveillance video. Judge Eleanor Ramirez, a 20-year veteran of the bench known for running an efficient courtroom and showing zero tolerance for procedural games, called the court to order precisely at 9 a.m. At 62, Judge Ramirez had presided over dozens of capital cases during her judicial career, developing a reputation for strict adherence to legal standards while maintaining the human dignity of the proceedings. Her opening remarks to the assembled jury pool emphasized the gravity of the task before them. You are being asked to participate in one of the most solemn responsibilities of citizenship, determining whether a fellow human being has committed crimes so severe that they may forfeit their liberty or even their life. The seriousness of her tone set the stage for a trial that would focus not only on the factual evidence, but on the weightiest questions of justice and punishment. Assistant District Attorney Amanda Walker led the prosecution team, her reputation as one of Miami's most formidable courtroom advocates preceding her. At 41, Walker had successfully prosecuted 15 murder cases, securing convictions in all of them and death sentences in the 7 capital cases she had handled. Her professional demeanor, authoritative without being overbearing, passionate without theatrics, had earned her the respect of judges and defense attorneys alike. For the James case, she had assembled a team that included junior prosecutor Jeffrey Chen, who would handle technical witnesses, and victims advocate Maria Delgado, who would work closely with the Sanchez and Rodriguez families throughout the proceedings, helping them navigate the often traumatizing experience of a murder trial. The defense table presented a stark contrast to the well-staffed prosecution team, with James represented by court-appointed attorney Daniel Friedman, accompanied only by a single paralegal. Friedman, a former public defender who now took on appointed cases in private practice, had the unenviable task of representing a client who had confessed on video and whose crimes had been captured in high definition from multiple angles. At 56, Friedman was known as a principled advocate who believed deeply in the constitutional right to zealous representation, regardless of the crime alleged or evidence presented. His strategy, as outlined in pre-trial motions, would focus not on challenging James's guilt, but on arguing against the death penalty based on mental health considerations. Dustin James himself sat at the defense table in a navy blue suit that seemed slightly too large for his frame, his expression as impassive as it had been during his interrogation 8 months earlier. At 26, James appeared younger than his age, with clean-cut features that belied the brutality of his actions. The snake tattoo that had helped identify him was concealed beneath his shirt sleeve, and his light brown hair had been neatly trimmed for court, presenting an image of normalcy that made the surveillance footage all the more jarring by contrast. Throughout the proceedings, James maintained an attentive posture, occasionally making notes on a legal pad or leaning to whisper comments to his attorney, but displaying none of the anxiety or distress typical of defendants facing potential execution. The jury selection process had been particularly challenging given the high-profile nature of the case and the widespread distribution of the surveillance footage in media coverage. Over 2 weeks, the attorneys had questioned more than 200 potential jurors, seeking to identify individuals who could set aside their prior knowledge of the case and judge the evidence fairly. The final panel consisted of 7 women and 5 men, diverse in age, race, and occupation. A cross-section of Miami's multicultural community that included a retired teacher, a software developer, a nurse, a construction foreman, and a university administrator, among others. 4 alternates were also selected, given the anticipated length of the trial and the emotional nature of the evidence to be presented. Judge Ramirez delivered preliminary instructions to the jury, explaining the presumption of innocence, the state's burden of proof, and the separate guilt and penalty phases that would occur if James was convicted of first-degree murder. She emphasized that while they might have seen news coverage of the case, their verdict must be based solely on the evidence presented in court. "What you may have heard outside this courtroom is not evidence," she instructed firmly. "Your duty is to consider only what you see and hear within these walls during these proceedings." With these fundamental principles established, the judge nodded to Assistant District Attorney Walker to begin her opening statement. Walker approached the podium with measured steps, carrying no notes. Her opening had been rehearsed until she could deliver it with both precision and apparent spontaneity. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and resolute, "this case is about 4 minutes on the night of July 17th, 4 minutes in which 2 lives were ended and countless others were forever changed." She paused, allowing the weight of this statement to settle over the courtroom. In those 4 minutes, Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez, 2 hard-working members of our community, encountered the defendant, Dustin James, who made a deliberate choice to end their lives for no reason other than his own curiosity about what it would feel like to kill another human being. The prosecutor continued by outlining what the evidence would show: the surveillance footage capturing the murders in their entirety, the recovery of the murder weapon from James's apartment, his full confession during interrogation, and the forensic evidence connecting him to the crimes. "But before I describe the evidence in detail," Walker said, her tone shifting, "I want to tell you about Gabriela and Carlos, the people whose lives were taken that night." She proceeded to humanize the victims, describing Gabriela's nursing studies and devotion to her family, and Carlos's military service and love for his 3 children. As she spoke, photographs of the victims were displayed on screens throughout the courtroom. Gabriela in her nursing scrubs during a clinical rotation, Carlos coaching his son's Little League team, images of lives fully lived until they intersected with James on that fatal night. After establishing the human cost of the crimes, Walker turned to the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. "Members of the jury," she said, her voice lowering slightly, "in most murder trials, the prosecution must reconstruct what happened through witness testimony, forensic evidence, and expert analysis. But in this case, you will see the murders themselves captured by the 7-Eleven surveillance system from multiple angles in high definition with clear audio." She paused, making eye contact with several jurors before continuing. "This evidence is disturbing. There is no way to soften or prepare you for watching 2 human beings lose their lives. But this footage reveals not just what happened, but how it happened, the calculated, emotionless efficiency with which the defendant executed Gabriela and Carlos without provocation or hesitation." Walker proceeded to describe how the surveillance footage would be supplemented by James's own statements during his interrogation, creating a complete picture of both the physical acts and the mindset behind them. The defendant told Detective Mitchell that he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone, she said, quoting directly from the recorded confession. He described selecting the store after driving by it several times, researching its layout online, and purchasing a gun specifically for the purpose of taking human life. These are not the actions of someone who killed in the heat of passion or in response to some perceived threat. These are the actions of someone who made a deliberate choice to end 2 lives out of sheer curiosity. The prosecutor concluded her opening statement by addressing the burden of proof and the gravity of the decision that would eventually face the jury. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming and unambiguous," she stated firmly. "By the end of this trial, we will have proven beyond any reasonable doubt that Dustin James committed these murders with premeditation and a complete disregard for human life. When that time comes, we will ask you to return a verdict that speaks the truth about what happened in those 4 minutes on July 17th, a verdict that provides justice for Gabriela Sanchez, Carlos Rodriguez, and the families who will forever feel their absence. With those words, Walker returned to her seat, the courtroom silent as Judge Ramirez turned to defense attorney Friedman for his opening statement. Friedman approached the podium with a different energy than Walker, less commanding, more contemplative, his lined face reflecting the weight of the task before him. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice softer but still clear. "My opening statement will be brief because many of the facts in this case are not in dispute. You will indeed see surveillance footage of the events at the 7-Eleven. You will hear my client's statements to police. These things happened." He paused, adjusting his glasses before continuing. "But a criminal trial, especially one where a human life hangs in the balance, must be about more than just what happened. It must also be about why it happened and who the person is that committed these acts." Friedman went on to outline the defense's primary contention, that while James had committed the acts shown in the surveillance footage, his mental state at the time, and his capacity to understand the moral implications of his actions would be a central question for the jury to consider. "The law recognizes that human behavior exists on a spectrum," he explained. "Some people are born with or develop conditions that affect how they perceive the world and interact with others. These conditions don't excuse criminal behavior, but they can help us understand it and determine the appropriate consequences." The attorney carefully avoided using specific diagnostic terms or making claims that might be perceived as an insanity defense, which pre-trial psychological evaluations had already determined would not be viable. "Throughout this trial," Friedman continued, "I will not ask you to disbelieve your eyes or to excuse the inexcusable. Instead, I will ask you to look beyond the 4 minutes captured on video and consider the 26 years that preceded them, years marked by isolation, psychological struggles, and a profound disconnection from normal human emotion." He concluded by reminding the jury of their duty to consider all the evidence with an open mind, and to remember that even in cases where guilt seems certain, the law demands careful deliberation about both the crimes and the appropriate punishment for the person who committed them. With opening statements concluded, Judge Ramirez called a brief recess before the presentation of evidence would begin. As the jury filed out, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense, with the families of the victims huddled together in obvious emotional distress after hearing the detailed descriptions of their loved ones' final moments. James, for his part, maintained the same detached demeanor he had shown throughout the proceedings, appearing almost bored as deputies escorted him back to the holding cell. The contrast between his apparent indifference and the grief palpably emanating from the victims' families underscored the central question that would hang over the entire trial. What kind of person could commit such acts with so little emotion, and what should society do with someone capable of such calculated violence? When court resumed, Assistant District Attorney Walker called her first witness, Trevor Mason, the college student who had discovered the bodies and called 911. Mason, now 20, appeared nervous as he took the stand, his hands visibly trembling as he was sworn in. Walker guided him gently through his testimony, asking him to describe what brought him to the 7-Eleven that night and what he found when he entered. "I was studying for finals and needed energy drinks," he explained, his voice steadying as he spoke. "When I walked in, I saw blood everywhere and 2 people on the floor. I knew right away they were dead." Mason described calling 911 immediately and waiting outside until police arrived, too shocked to process fully what he had seen. The prosecution played a recording of his 911 call. the young man's panicked voice filling the courtroom as he told the dispatcher, "There's blood everywhere. 2 people. They're not moving. Please send someone now." Following Mason's testimony, Walker called a succession of law enforcement witnesses who had responded to the scene, each describing what they had observed and the steps taken to secure evidence. Officer Ramon Diaz, the first responder, testified about entering the store and confirming that both victims were deceased. Crime scene technician Jennifer Oakes detailed the recovery of shell casings and bullets, the blood spatter analysis, and the initial review of the surveillance system. With each witness, the prosecution built a methodical foundation for what everyone in the courtroom knew was coming: the presentation of the surveillance footage itself. By mid-afternoon, Walker had established the necessary context and procedural foundation to introduce the cornerstone of the state's case. "Your Honor," she addressed Judge Ramirez, "the state would like to present State's Exhibit 17, the surveillance footage from the 7-Eleven on the night of July 17th. After the judge ruled the evidence admissible, Walker turned to the jury. "What you are about to see is disturbing," she warned them. "It shows the actual murders of Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez. I ask that you watch carefully, as this footage reveals not just what the defendant did, but how he did it, with calculation, precision, and complete disregard for human life." The courtroom lights were dimmed, and screens positioned throughout the room displayed the footage, beginning with Dustin James entering the store at 11:47 p.m. The high-definition video showed James browsing the aisles, occasionally glancing at Gabriela behind the counter and Carlos at the coffee station. After selecting bottled water, James approached the counter and asked for cigarettes. As Gabriela turned to retrieve them, James drew the 9mm handgun from his waistband and fired twice in quick succession, striking her in the chest. Without hesitation, he pivoted and fired once at Carlos, who had begun to turn at the sound of the first shots, striking him in the head. The footage continued, showing James calmly stepping behind the counter to empty the cash register before exiting the store, pausing only to take a candy bar from a display near the door. Throughout the viewing, the courtroom remained silent, except for muffled sobs from the victims' families. Several jurors visibly recoiled when the shots were fired, and one older woman on the panel briefly covered her eyes before forcing herself to watch. James himself showed no reaction to seeing his actions replayed, his expression unchanged as he watched himself take 2 lives on screen. When the footage concluded, Judge Ramirez called for a 15-minute recess, recognizing the emotional impact of what the jury had just witnessed. As the jurors filed out, many appeared shaken, avoiding eye contact with both the defendant and the victims' families. The first day of trial concluded with testimony from Detective Zachary Mitchell, who described the initial investigation and the process of identifying James through the surveillance footage. Mitchell's testimony would continue the following day, including his account of James's arrest and the subsequent interrogation that had yielded a full confession. As court adjourned, the weight of the evidence presented hung heavy in the air, with legal analysts commenting that they had rarely seen a murder case with such unambiguous visual documentation of the crimes. The surveillance footage had transformed an already strong prosecution case into something approaching certainty, leaving the defense with few options beyond attempting to mitigate the eventual punishment. The trial's second week centered on expert testimony, with prosecutors methodically connecting the physical evidence to the actions captured in the surveillance footage and the statements made by James during his interrogation. Dr. Elaine Cortez, the chief medical examiner for Miami-Dade County, took the stand on Monday morning, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a professional bun as she prepared to present the autopsy findings for both victims. With 22 years of experience and over 3,000 autopsies performed, Dr. Cortez possessed the rare ability to communicate complex forensic information in terms accessible to the jury while maintaining the dignified tone the subject demanded. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing the deliberate and lethal intent behind James's actions, as captured in the store's surveillance system. Gabriela Sanchez died from 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, Dr. Cortez explained, using anatomical diagrams rather than the graphic autopsy, photographs to illustrate her findings out of respect for the victims' families present in the courtroom. The first bullet entered her left chest, perforating the heart, and causing catastrophic blood loss that would have resulted in death within approximately 30 to 60 seconds. The medical examiner's clinical description contrasted sharply with the emotional reality of what she was describing, though her voice softened slightly as she continued. The second bullet entered her right chest, penetrating the lung, but would have been survivable with immediate medical intervention had the first wound not already caused fatal damage. When questioned by Assistant District Attorney Walker about the precision of the shots, Dr. Cortez confirmed what the surveillance footage had suggested. Both shots were clustered in what we call the center mass of the torso, the area most likely to cause fatal injury when struck. Walker followed up. In your professional opinion, would someone need special training to target this area so effectively? The medical examiner's response was measured but clear. While I cannot speak to the shooter's training, I can state that both bullets struck areas that would maximize the probability of a fatal outcome. Either the shooter was trained or extremely fortunate in his shot placement. Dr. Cortez's testimony regarding Carlos Rodriguez was equally precise and disturbing. Mr. Rodriguez died from a single gunshot wound to the head, entering at the right temple and traversing through the brain before lodging in the left side of the skull. She explained that death would have been nearly instantaneous, with the bullet's path destroying the brainstem and cerebellum. When asked about the angle of the shot, Dr. Cortez referred to the surveillance footage. The video shows that Mr. Rodriguez had begun to turn at the sound of the first shots fired at Ms. Sanchez. The bullet entered at precisely the moment he had turned his head enough to expose his temple to the shooter's position, again suggesting either remarkable timing or the shooter's ability to adjust his aim in a fraction of a second. The most significant expert testimony came from Dr. Marcus Reed, a digital forensics specialist with the FBI who had been brought in to analyze the surveillance footage in minute detail. Dr. Reed, a 47-year-old former computer science professor with a specialization in video analytics, had examined thousands of hours of surveillance footage during his 12 years with the Bureau, testifying in over 70 criminal trials. His analysis of the 7/11 footage went far beyond what the jury had observed during the initial viewing, employing advanced enhancement techniques and behavioral analysis to extract additional layers of information from the video record of the murders. What makes this case unique from a forensic perspective is the exceptional quality of the source material, Dr. Reed explained, as he was qualified as an expert witness. The 7/11 had installed a state-of-the-art digital surveillance system just 3 months before the incident, featuring multiple 4K ultra-high-definition cameras with advanced low-light capabilities and directional audio recording. He described how this system captured approximately 28 times more visual information than standard security cameras, allowing for unprecedented clarity when analyzing subtle details such as facial expressions, body language, and precise movements. The prosecution had provided him with the raw, uncompressed video files directly from the system's servers, ensuring no loss of quality that might have occurred through copying or conversion. With Judge Ramirez's permission, Dr. Reed presented a specialized analysis of the footage, beginning with James's entrance into the store. Using behavioral analysis techniques developed by the FBI, I examined the defendant's movements from the moment he enters the frame, he explained, using a laser pointer to indicate specific details on the courtroom screens. What we observe is a pattern consistent with what we call predatory scanning. The subject enters and immediately performs a systematic visual survey of the environment, noting camera positions, exit points, and the location of potential witnesses. The enhanced footage clearly showed James's eyes moving in a deliberate pattern, making brief but repeated eye contact with the store's ceiling corners where cameras were mounted. Dr. Reed continued his analysis through James's time in the store before the shootings, identifying what he called preparatory positioning. The subject spends approximately 3 minutes and 20 seconds moving through the store in what appears to be casual browsing, but is actually creating opportunities to observe both victims while maintaining advantageous positions relative to the entrance and exit. Enhanced segments showed James repeatedly adjusting his position to maintain sightlines to both Gabriela behind the counter and Carlos at the coffee station, while also keeping the front door within his peripheral vision. This behavior is inconsistent with the random movements typical of actual shopping, but aligns with tactical surveillance patterns observed in premeditated violent crimes. The most compelling portion of Dr. Reed's testimony focused on the micro-expressions and body language visible in the enhanced footage during and immediately after the shootings. At the moment the subject draws his weapon, we observe none of the physiological indicators typically associated with extreme stress or emotional arousal, he explained, showing frame-by-frame analysis of James's face and posture. There is no elevated breathing pattern, no tension in the facial muscles, no tremor in the hands, all of which would normally be present in an individual experiencing fear, anger, or even excitement during a violent act. The forensic specialist contrasted this with what he called target acquisition and execution, noting the mechanical precision with which James shifted from Gabriela to Carlos, adjusting his aim in a fraction of a second to account for Carlos's turning motion. Perhaps the most disturbing element of Dr. Reed's analysis came from what he identified in the moments after both victims had fallen. At approximately 11:49 and 12 seconds after confirming both victims are incapacitated, the subject displays what we classify as a satisfaction response, a brief but distinct micro-expression involving the zygomaticus major muscle associated with smiling and the orbicularis oculi, the muscle surrounding the eye that activates during genuine positive emotional responses. The enhanced footage, slowed to 1/8 speed and magnified on James's face, clearly showed this momentary expression before his features returned to their previous neutral state. This type of response is extremely unusual in impulsive or emotion-driven violence, but can occur in predatory violence where the perpetrator derives satisfaction from the successful execution of a planned act. Defense attorney Friedman cross-examined Dr. Reed vigorously, questioning whether such subtle expressions could reliably indicate specific emotional states and suggesting that the enhancement techniques might create artifacts that could be misinterpreted. Isn't it possible, Dr. Reed, that what you're identifying as a satisfaction response could simply be a nervous tic or an involuntary muscle movement unrelated to emotion? Reed acknowledged that individual expressions must be interpreted within a broader context, but stood firm on his analysis. When we consider this expression in conjunction with the subject's overall behavioral pattern throughout the incident, the calm execution, the methodical movements, the absence of stress indicators, the most consistent interpretation is that of satisfaction following successful completion of an intended action. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from ballistics expert James Hargrove, who confirmed that the bullets recovered from the scene and the victims' bodies matched the Glock 17 found in James's apartment. The striations on the bullets are like a fingerprint specific to that individual weapon, Hargrove explained, showing side-by-side microscopic comparisons on the courtroom screens. There is no doubt that the bullets that killed Ms. Sanchez and Mr. Rodriguez were fired from the weapon recovered from the defendant's kitchen drawer. Hargrove also testified about the functionality of the weapon, noting that it required deliberate pressure on the trigger and did not have a hair trigger that might discharge accidentally. Detective Zachary Mitchell returned to the stand to present the interrogation video, which proved almost as damning as the surveillance footage itself. The jury watched as James calmly admitted to the murders, described his preparation, and stated his motive as simply wanting to know what it felt like to kill someone. Mitchell testified about his extensive experience interviewing homicide suspects, noting that James's affect and responses were unlike any he had encountered in his career. Most suspects show some emotion when confronted with evidence of their crimes: anger, fear, remorse, sometimes even pride or bravado, the detective explained. Mr. James displayed none of these. He discussed taking 2 human lives with the same emotional engagement someone might use to describe changing a light bulb. The prosecution's digital evidence continued with testimony from computer forensic analyst Sophia Kim, who had examined James's laptop and phone. The defendant's search history in the weeks leading up to the murders included multiple queries related to security cameras in convenience stores, how police trace bullets to guns, and methods for avoiding identification during crimes, Kim testified, displaying screenshots of the search results. More disturbing were James's searches about the experience of killing, including multiple variations of "What does it feel like to take a life?" and visits to forums where people discussed their fascination with death and violence. Kim also presented location data from James's phone that placed him driving past the 7-Eleven 3 times in the week before the murders, corroborating the surveillance analyst's assessment of preparatory behavior. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, they called their final expert witness, Dr. Elaine Haraway, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated James while he awaited trial. Though defense attorney Friedman objected to her testimony during the guilt phase rather than the penalty phase, Judge Ramirez allowed it on the grounds that Dr. Haraway would speak to James's state of mind and capacity for premeditation, both relevant to the charges at hand. Dr. Haraway, with over 20 years of experience evaluating violent offenders, had conducted 6 separate interviews with James, administered standardized psychological assessments, and reviewed his personal history, journal entries, and behavior both before and after the murders. Based on my evaluation, Mr. James exhibits significant traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder with pronounced psychopathic features, Dr. Haraway testified, her crisp British accent lending additional gravity to her words. These include a profound lack of empathy, failure to conform to social norms, indifference to the suffering of others, and perhaps most relevant to this case, a tendency to engage in behaviors for personal gratification without regard for consequences to others. She carefully explained that this assessment did not constitute an insanity defense, as James clearly understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions at the time they were committed. An individual can have a personality disorder and still make conscious, deliberate choices for which they are legally responsible, she clarified for the jury. Dr. Haraway's testimony regarding James's journal entries proved particularly illuminating regarding his mindset leading up to the murders. The writings show a progressive detachment from normal human connection, replaced by fantasies of power and control, she explained. There is a recurring theme of invisibility, feeling unseen or insignificant, contrasted with speculation about how committing a violent act might make him seen or remembered. When Assistant District Attorney Walker asked about James's statement that he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone, Dr. Haraway characterized it as consistent with both his psychological profile and his writings. For individuals with severe empathy deficits, others may become objects of curiosity rather than fellow humans with intrinsic value. The act of killing becomes an experiment, a novel experience to be tried, rather than the profound moral transgression most people would perceive. Defense attorney Friedman's cross-examination focused on whether James's psychological condition diminished his capacity for rational decision-making or moral understanding. Would you agree, doctor, that someone with antisocial personality disorder experiences the world fundamentally differently than those without the condition? He asked. Dr. Haraway acknowledged this, but drew an important distinction. Yes, their emotional and empathic experience differs significantly, but their cognitive understanding, their ability to know right from wrong, to understand laws and consequences, typically remains intact. Friedman pressed further, asking if James could be considered emotionally disabled in a way that might mitigate his culpability, but the psychiatrist maintained her position that James made a deliberate choice with full awareness of its legal and moral implications, even if he did not feel the emotional weight that would deter most people from such actions. As the prosecution prepared to rest its case, Assistant District Attorney Walker called one final witness, Maria Rodriguez, the widow of Carlos Rodriguez. Her testimony was brief but powerful, giving a human dimension to the loss that the clinical evidence and expert analyses had documented. Maria described the last conversation she had with her husband before he left for his overnight shift at Mercy Hospital, how he had kissed their sleeping children on his way out, and how the Miami police officers had arrived at her door at 2 a.m. to deliver news that had collapsed her world. "Our youngest still asks when Daddy is coming home," she told the hushed courtroom, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I tell him Daddy is in heaven, but how do you explain to a 4-year-old that someone took his father away just to see what it felt like?" With Maria Rodriguez's testimony, the prosecution rested its case, having presented what legal observers described as overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder. The surveillance footage had provided the jury with a window into the actual commission of the crimes. The forensic experts had analyzed every aspect of James's behavior before, during, and after the killings, and the psychiatric testimony had offered insight into the mindset that allowed such calculated violence. As Judge Ramirez adjourned court for the day, instructing the jury to return the following morning for the beginning of the defense case, the question hanging over the proceedings was not whether Dustin James had committed the murders, but what, if anything, his attorney could say to contextualize actions that the entire courtroom had witnessed in high definition. After 14 days of testimony, 97 exhibits, and 28 witnesses, the fate of Dustin James rested in the hands of 12 Miami citizens who had watched him execute 2 innocent people in the crystal-clear surveillance footage that had become the centerpiece of the trial. Deliberations began on a Wednesday morning, following closing arguments from both sides, Assistant District Attorney Amanda Walker emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crimes and the complete absence of mitigating factors, while Defense Attorney Daniel Friedman acknowledged his client's actions while asking jurors to consider James's psychological state as they determined the appropriate verdict. Judge Eleanor Ramirez had instructed the jury on the applicable law, explaining the elements required for first-degree murder and the lesser-included offenses they could consider if they found the evidence insufficient for the most serious charge. The jury room, a wood-paneled chamber adjacent to courtroom 4B, became the scene of intense discussions as the 12 men and women began the process of reviewing the evidence and reaching their decision. The deliberations were not made public, but jurors would later describe the process as surprisingly straightforward, given the overwhelming evidence presented during the trial. The surveillance footage was really the beginning and end of our discussions about guilt. Juror number 5, a 48-year-old elementary school teacher, would tell reporters after the trial concluded. "We watched it again during deliberations, and it showed exactly what the prosecution claimed, a man who walked into a store and methodically killed 2 people without provocation or apparent emotion. While the jury deliberated, an uneasy calm settled over the courthouse with the families of Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez gathering in a private room provided by the Victims' Services Division. Elena Sanchez, Gabriela's mother, led the group in prayer, her voice steady despite the emotional toll of the past 2 weeks witnessing the evidence of her daughter's final moments. "We pray for justice, but also for peace," she said, her husband Miguel holding her hand as their younger son stood beside them. "Gabi would not want hatred to consume our hearts, even now." Across the room, Maria Rodriguez sat with her 3 children, the oldest 2 old enough to understand what was happening, but shielded from the graphic details of their father's death, the youngest playing quietly with toys provided by court staff, mercifully unaware of the gravity of the proceedings that would determine his father's killer's fate. Dustin James awaited the verdict in a holding cell adjacent to the courtroom, still displaying the same detached demeanor that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. His attorney, Daniel Friedman, visited briefly to explain the possible outcomes and what would happen procedurally with each verdict, but reported that James showed little interest in the details. He asked about lunch. Friedman later confided to a colleague the frustration evident in his voice despite his professional commitment to zealous representation regardless of the crime or client. 14 days of trial facing the death penalty, and he asked if he could get a different sandwich than the one provided by corrections. The call came after just 4 hours and 17 minutes of deliberation, remarkably swift for a capital case, though not surprising given the nature of the evidence. Judge Ramirez reconvened court at 2:30 p.m., the courtroom falling silent as the jury filed in, their expressions solemn as they took their seats. The court clerk collected the verdict form from the foreperson, a 56-year-old accountant whose hands trembled slightly as she handed over the document that would determine James's fate. The clerk passed the form to Judge Ramirez, who reviewed it briefly before returning it, her expression revealing nothing as she instructed the defendant to stand for the reading of the verdict. As to count 1, the first-degree murder of Gabriela Sanchez, we, the jury, find the defendant, Dustin James, guilty as charged, the clerk read, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom. As to count 2, the first-degree murder of Carlos Rodriguez, we, the jury, find the defendant, Dustin James, guilty as charged. She continued through the remaining counts, armed robbery and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, with guilty verdicts on each. Judge Ramirez then asked if the jury wished to have the jury polled, a procedural step to confirm that each juror agreed with the verdict. Friedman requested this formality, and each juror individually affirmed their agreement with the guilty verdicts on all counts. The families of the victims received the verdicts with quiet tears, embracing each other as the words they had waited 8 months to hear were finally spoken. Elena Sanchez closed her eyes and whispered, "Gracias a Dios," as her husband held her tightly, while Maria Rodriguez buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The courtroom remained remarkably quiet during this moment, the typical outbursts or reactions that often follow, verdicts in high-profile cases notably absent, perhaps because the outcome had seemed inevitable given the surveillance footage that had shown the crimes in such unflinching detail. James himself showed no visible reaction to the verdict, standing impassively as the jury declared him guilty of double murder, his expression unchanged from what it had been throughout the trial. This lack of response did not go unnoticed by the jury or the courtroom observers, with several jurors later commenting that it reinforced the psychiatric testimony about James's profound empathy deficit. Even at that moment when his own life was hanging in the balance, there was just nothing. Juror number 8, a 34-year-old nurse would later tell the Miami Herald. No anger, no fear, no remorse. It was like he was watching something happening to someone else. Judge Ramirez thanked the jury for their service and explained that they would return the following week for the penalty phase of the trial, during which they would hear additional evidence and ultimately recommend whether James should receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. She instructed them to avoid media coverage of the case and not to discuss their deliberations with anyone until the entire process was complete. As the jurors filed out, the judge set a date for the beginning of the penalty phase and ordered James returned to custody, concluding the day's proceedings with a sharp rap of her gavel. The verdict dominated Miami news that evening, with local stations interrupting regular programming to announce that Dustin James had been found guilty on all counts in what reporters were calling the 7-Eleven surveillance murders. The footage from the convenience store, which had been played repeatedly during news coverage in the months leading up to the trial, was shown again, though stations now included viewer warnings about its graphic nature. Legal analysts appeared on every channel discussing the speed of the jury's decision and the likelihood of a death penalty recommendation, given the particularly callous nature of the crimes and the lack of apparent mitigating factors. This verdict surprises no one who followed the evidence in this case. Former prosecutor and legal commentator Sofia Mendez told viewers of Miami's WPLG Local 10 News. The surveillance footage provided the kind of direct evidence that prosecutors usually only dream about. The jury literally watched the defendant commit the murders. What makes this case particularly chilling, and what will almost certainly factor into the penalty decision, is the complete lack of emotion or remorse James has displayed, from the moment captured on video through the entirety of the trial. The families of the victims spoke briefly to the press following the verdict, expressing gratitude for the jury's decision, while acknowledging that no outcome could truly provide closure for their loss. Today, the truth about what happened to our Gabriela was formally recognized by the justice system, Elena Sanchez said, standing with her husband and son outside the courthouse. We are grateful for the jury's careful consideration and for the prosecutors who fought for our daughter, but this verdict cannot bring her back to us. She concluded with a statement about forgiveness that moved many of the assembled reporters to tears. As Catholics, we are taught to forgive, even in the face of the unforgivable. We will try to find that forgiveness in our hearts, not for the sake of the man who took our daughter, but for our own peace. Maria Rodriguez echoed similar sentiments, speaking softly as she stood surrounded by her late husband's fellow security officers from Mercy Hospital who had attended the trial in a show of solidarity. Carlos believed in justice. It's why he served our country in the military and why he was studying to become a police officer, she said, her voice steady, despite her evident emotion. Today's verdict is justice for him and for our children, who will grow up knowing that the system their father believed in worked as it should. When asked about her thoughts on the upcoming penalty phase, Maria declined to state a preference, saying only, "No punishment can equal what he took from us, but we trust the jury to make the right decision." The week between the guilt and penalty phases saw intense debate in Miami and beyond about the appropriate punishment for Dustin James. The case had garnered national attention, in part because of the surveillance footage that had made the evidence unusually accessible to the public, but also because it raised profound questions about justice in cases involving defendants with apparent psychological abnormalities, who nonetheless did not meet the legal standard for insanity. Opinion pieces appeared in major newspapers, with some arguing that James's clear mental pathology should preclude the death penalty, while others contended that his calculated violence and lack of remorse made him precisely the kind of defendant for whom capital punishment was designed. The penalty phase began the following Tuesday, with both prosecution and defense presenting evidence specifically related to sentencing considerations. Assistant District Attorney Walker presented what the law terms aggravating factors, elements that would justify the more severe punishment of death rather than life imprisonment. These included the cold, calculated nature of the crimes, the fact that multiple victims were killed in a single criminal episode. The murders were committed during the course of another felony, robbery, and the particularly heinous, atrocious, or cruel manner in which the victims were killed without any chance to defend themselves or even comprehend what was happening before their lives were taken. Defense attorney Friedman, in turn, presented mitigating factors that he argued should result in a life sentence rather than execution. These focused primarily on James's psychological condition, with additional expert testimony from Dr. Rebecca Thornton, a neuropsychologist who had conducted extensive testing of James and found abnormalities in brain regions associated with empathy and emotional processing. While these findings do not excuse Mr. James's actions, Dr. Thornton testified, they do help explain his profound deficit in normal human connection and emotion. Friedman also presented evidence about James's childhood, including testimony from a former teacher who described him as a desperately lonely child who struggled to form friendships and showed concerning behaviors as early as elementary school. After 3 days of testimony in the penalty phase, the jury received their final instructions from Judge Ramirez, who explained the weighing process for aggravating and mitigating factors, and emphasized that Florida law required a unanimous recommendation for the death penalty. "This is perhaps the weightiest decision our legal system asks citizens to make," she told them, her tone solemn. "You must consider all the evidence presented in both phases of the trial and determine whether the appropriate punishment is life in prison without the possibility of parole or death by lethal injection." The jury's penalty deliberations lasted significantly longer than their guilt deliberations, nearly 11 hours spread over 2 days, suggesting that at least some members struggled with the ultimate decision despite the horrific nature of the crimes. When they finally returned to the courtroom on Friday afternoon, the tension was palpable as the foreperson handed the recommendation form to the clerk. As to the appropriate sentence for Dustin James, having been found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, the jury unanimously recommends a sentence of death, the clerk read, her voice slightly unsteady with the gravity of the announcement. As with the guilty verdict, James showed no visible reaction to learning that the jury had recommended he be put to death, his expression remaining impassive as Judge Ramirez thanked the jurors for their service and dismissed them from the case. The judge explained that she would formally sentence James at a later hearing after considering the jury's recommendation, though in Florida, judges typically follow the jury's unanimous decision in capital cases. Court was adjourned with James being led away by deputies, still displaying the same detachment that had characterized his demeanor throughout the entire proceedings. Outside the courthouse, reactions to the death penalty recommendation were mixed, reflecting the broader societal debate about capital punishment. Supporters of the sentence pointed to the surveillance footage, arguing that anyone who could commit such calculated violence without remorse posed a permanent danger to society. Opponents questioned whether executing James addressed the underlying issues of mental health and early intervention that might have prevented the tragedy in the first place. The families of the victims, having sat through every minute of the harrowing testimony about their loved ones' final moments, expressed simply that they were ready for the legal process to conclude so they could continue their journey toward healing. The verdict and sentence recommendation do not bring Gabriela back to us, Elena Sanchez told reporters as she left the courthouse for the final time. But they do provide an answer to the question of whether justice exists in this world. She paused, looking up at the Miami sky, as if searching for her daughter there, before adding, "Now we must find a way to live with the space she left behind." Beside her, Maria Rodriguez nodded in agreement, holding her youngest child in her arms as she spoke briefly. Carlos believed that actions have consequences. Today that principle was upheld. For our children, that matters. As the sun set over Miami that evening, the case that had begun with 4 minutes of surveillance footage capturing the worst of human capacity for violence was drawing to its legal conclusion. The convenience store where Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez had lost their lives had reopened months earlier, though a small memorial plaque now hung beside the entrance, bearing their names and the date of the tragedy. The community had not forgotten, but like all communities touched by violence, it had found ways to move forward while honoring those who were lost. The surveillance cameras that had captured the murders remained in place, silent witnesses to the everyday transactions that had resumed in a space once marked by unspeakable tragedy. 6 weeks after the jury's unanimous recommendation for the death penalty, Dustin James returned to Courtroom 4B for his formal sentencing hearing before Judge Eleanor Ramirez. The courtroom was less crowded than during the trial itself, the media interest having somewhat waned now that the verdict and penalty recommendation were known, but the front rows remained filled with the families of Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of grief that time had softened but not erased. James, dressed in the same navy suit he had worn throughout the trial, sat beside his attorney with the same impassive expression that had become his hallmark, a blank canvas that revealed nothing of his thoughts as he faced the formal pronouncement of his punishment for taking 2 lives at a Miami 7-Eleven 8 months earlier. Judge Ramirez opened the hearing by explaining that she had thoroughly reviewed the trial transcript, the jury's recommendation, and all applicable law before making her final determination regarding sentencing. The decision to impose the ultimate punishment is one that weighs heavily on any court, she stated, her voice steady but grave. It requires careful consideration of not just the crimes themselves, but of our collective values as a society and what justice truly demands in the face of such profound violation of human life. The judge then invited statements from the victims' families, a traditional part of sentencing that gives those most affected by the crime an opportunity to address the court and the defendant directly. Elena Sanchez was the first to approach the podium, carrying a framed photograph of her daughter in her nursing scrubs, which she placed beside her as she spoke. "My Gabriela was studying to heal people," she began, her accented English clear despite the emotion evident in her voice. "She worked nights at that store so she could spend her days learning how to save lives, the opposite of what this man chose to do with his freedom." Elena described the void left by her daughter's absence, empty chairs at Sunday family dinners, the nursing school graduation that would never happen, the future patients who would never benefit from Gabriela's care and compassion. "When you took her life, you did not just kill my daughter, you killed all the good she would have done in this world, all the people she would have helped, all the lives she might have saved. This is a debt that can never be repaid." Carlos Rodriguez's widow, Maria, spoke next, her 3 children standing beside her, the oldest 2 holding photos of their father, the youngest clutching a teddy bear, dressed in a security guard uniform like the one Carlos had worn to work. "My husband survived 2 tours in Afghanistan only to be murdered while buying coffee on his way to work," Maria said, her voice occasionally breaking as she addressed the court. "He was a man who understood duty and sacrifice, who came home from war and dedicated himself to protecting others in his work at the hospital." She described how Carlos had been studying criminal justice, hoping to become a police officer, and how he coached Little League despite his exhausting schedule because he believed in being present for his children. "These 3 children will grow up without their father because someone wanted to know what it felt like to kill, a curiosity that has cost us everything." After the families had spoken, Judge Ramirez asked if James wished to address the court before sentencing, a procedural opportunity that defendants often use to express remorse or offer explanation. Defense attorney Friedman whispered to his client, who nodded slightly before rising. "I understand that I'm expected to apologize or show remorse," James said, his voice flat and emotionless. "But I think that would be dishonest, and if nothing else, I've been honest throughout this process." He paused, glancing briefly at the families before continuing. "I did what I did for the reasons I've stated. I can't feel what you want me to feel about it. That's just the truth." With that, he sat down, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence at what many would later describe as the most chilling non-apology they had ever witnessed. Judge Ramirez's expression remained neutral as she prepared to deliver her decision, though those who knew her well might have detected the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated controlled anger. "Dustin James, the jury has found you guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of armed robbery, and 1 count of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony," she began, reciting the charges for the formal record. "They have unanimously recommended that you be sentenced to death for these crimes. And after careful consideration of all factors, I find that this recommendation is supported by the evidence and the law." The judge continued, addressing not just the legal basis for her decision, but the moral dimension as well. "The surveillance footage that captured your crimes shows something beyond the physical act of taking 2 lives. It reveals a profound absence of the most basic human quality that binds us together as a society: empathy." She referenced James's own statement during interrogation that he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. That curiosity, that experiment with human life, as if it were of no more consequence than any other novel experience, represents the very definition of the cold, calculated premeditation that our most severe punishment is designed to address. Judge Ramirez formally sentenced James to death by lethal injection for each of the 2 murder counts, plus consecutive sentences for the additional charges. She explained that the sentences would automatically be appealed, as required by Florida law in all death penalty cases, and that the execution would not take place until that process was complete, likely taking several years. With these final procedural matters addressed, she concluded the hearing, and deputies led James away, his expression unchanged by the formal condemnation of his actions and the pronouncement of his ultimate fate. The automatic appeal process for James's case began almost immediately, with the Office of the Public Defender's Capital Appeals Division taking over from trial attorney Daniel Friedman. The appellate process in death penalty cases is deliberately thorough and methodical, designed to ensure that constitutional rights are protected and that no legal errors occurred that might have affected the verdict or sentence. James's initial appeal focused on several issues, including whether the extensive pretrial publicity surrounding the surveillance footage had made a fair trial impossible, whether Dr. Haraway's psychiatric testimony should have been limited to the penalty phase, and whether the judge's instructions to the jury adequately explained the consideration of mental health as a mitigating factor. The Florida Supreme Court, which reviews all death penalty cases in the state, took nearly 2 years to issue its ruling, ultimately affirming both James's conviction and his death sentence in a unanimous decision. Justice Maria Alvarez, writing for the court, addressed each of the defense's claims in turn, finding that the extensive jury selection process had successfully identified jurors who could set aside their prior knowledge of the case, that Dr. Haraway's testimony was properly admitted as relevant to James's state of mind during the commission of the crimes, and that the jury instructions correctly stated the law regarding mental health considerations in capital sentencing. While the evidence against the defendant was undeniably strong, Justice Alvarez wrote, The record reflects that all constitutional protections and procedural safeguards were meticulously observed throughout the proceedings. Following the state Supreme Court's affirmation, James's case entered the federal appellate system, with his attorneys filing habeas corpus petitions in federal district court and eventually the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. These proceedings stretched over several more years, as is typical in capital cases, with each court ultimately concluding that James had received a fair trial and that his constitutional rights had been protected throughout the process. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case, effectively exhausting James's direct appeals and moving his case into the final stages of collateral review, where new evidence or changes in relevant law could still potentially affect his sentence. Throughout this extended legal process, the families of Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez attempted to rebuild their lives in the shadow of their loss, each finding different paths toward healing. Elena and Miguel Sanchez established the Gabriela Sanchez Memorial Nursing Scholarship at Miami-Dade College, providing financial assistance to students working night shifts to put themselves through nursing school. We want Gabriela's compassion and dedication to live on through others who share her dream, Elena explained at the scholarship's inaugural award ceremony, where 3 students received funding that would allow them to reduce their work hours and focus more on their studies. Every life these nurses save in their careers will be part of our daughter's legacy. Maria Rodriguez, meanwhile, moved with her children to Tampa, seeking a fresh start in a city where they weren't known as the family of a murder victim whose death had been broadcast repeatedly on local news. The children needed to be somewhere they could just be kids, not the children whose father was killed at the 7-Eleven, she explained in a rare interview 3 years after the murder. She had used the life insurance payout and victim compensation funds to purchase a modest home near her sister's family, providing her children with the stability and extended family support they needed. The oldest Rodriguez child, now a teenager, had joined a youth police cadet program inspired by the career his father had been working toward when his life was cut short. The 7-Eleven, where the murders occurred, remained open, though ownership had changed hands twice in the years following the tragedy. The memorial plaque beside the entrance had been expanded into a small garden area with benches, maintained by community volunteers and occasionally visited by Miami-Dade College nursing students who would leave flowers for Gabriela. The store itself had undergone renovations that completely changed its interior layout, a practical business decision that had the additional benefit of transforming a space marked by trauma. The surveillance system that had captured the murders had been upgraded several times, becoming part of a company-wide initiative to improve security across all locations. The Miami Police Department incorporated the surveillance footage from the case into their training programs, using it as a study in both the value of high-quality security systems and the behavioral indicators of premeditated violence. Detective Zachary Mitchell, who had led the investigation, became a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences, sharing insights from the case that had come to define the latter part of his career. The James case demonstrated how digital evidence has transformed homicide investigations, Mitchell explained during one such presentation. What might have once been a challenging case with limited physical evidence became essentially open and shut because of that surveillance system. It's something we now emphasize to business owners. Good cameras aren't just for catching shoplifters. They can be the difference between justice and an unsolved murder. 7 years after the murders, as James's case moved through its final legal stages, the surviving families received notification that an execution date had been set. The announcement brought a complex mix of emotions, a sense that justice was being fulfilled, but also a reopening of wounds that had begun to heal with time. "I thought I wanted this moment," Elena Sanchez confided to her pastor. But now that it's here, I realize it changes nothing about our loss. Gabriela will still be gone tomorrow, whether he is alive or dead." This sentiment reflected a shift in her perspective over the years, from the raw desire for justice that had sustained her through the trial to a more nuanced understanding of the limitations of punishment in addressing grief. For Maria Rodriguez, the notification prompted difficult conversations with her children, particularly the older two who had now reached an age where they fully understood what had happened to their father. They asked if watching him die would make us feel better, Maria shared with her victim advocate, who had remained in contact with the family throughout the years. "I told them that nothing will ever make what happened better, but that seeing the case finally conclude might help us close one chapter and focus more fully on honoring their father through how we live our lives." She made the difficult decision not attend the execution, choosing instead to take her children to Carlos's favorite beach on that day to celebrate his life rather than witness his killer's death. On a cool Florida evening in November, 7 years and 4 months after he walked into a Miami 7-Eleven and ended 2 lives in less than 4 minutes, Dustin James was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. His final statement, recorded by prison officials, maintained the same detachment that had characterized his behavior throughout the case. "I still don't regret what I did. I found out what I wanted to know." Few witnesses attended the execution beyond the required officials and media representatives, a stark contrast to the packed courtroom that had watched the surveillance footage of his crimes years earlier. The Miami Herald's headline the following morning read simply, "Justice served, 7-Eleven, killer executed," with a small sidebar noting that James had maintained his lack of remorse until the end. The conclusion of James's case prompted renewed discussions in Florida and beyond about mental health intervention, the death penalty, and the role of surveillance in modern justice. Mental health advocates pointed to James's childhood indicators of antisocial behavior as missed opportunities for intervention that might have prevented the tragedy. Criminal justice experts debated whether the death penalty served its intended purpose in cases involving defendants with severe personality disorders. Privacy advocates and security consultants engaged in nuanced conversations about the balance between surveillance that solves crimes and concerns about an increasingly monitored society. What remained undisputed was the impact of the case on how convenience stores and similar businesses approach security. In the years following the murders, 7-Eleven Corporation and many other retail chains upgraded their surveillance systems to the high-definition standard that had been crucial in James's case. The Florida Retail Federation developed a security grant program to help small businesses afford similar technology, explicitly referencing the Miami case in their promotional materials. Clear video doesn't just solve crimes, it can prevent them by deterring those who know they'll be identified. This tangible change in security practices across the industry became an unexpected legacy of the tragedy, potentially preventing similar incidents through improved surveillance and faster identification of threats. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy, however, emerged from the lives touched by Gabriela Sanchez and Carlos Rodriguez during their time on Earth, and the good done in their names afterward. By the 10th anniversary of their deaths, the Gabriela Sanchez Memorial Nursing Scholarship had helped 37 students complete their nursing degrees, with graduates working throughout Florida's healthcare system. Carlos Rodriguez's children had grown into young adults, with his oldest son attending college on a military ROTC scholarship, planning to follow his father's path of service. The Miami community that had been shocked by the surveillance footage of their murders had transformed that horror into concrete actions, improved security measures, mental health awareness initiatives, and support systems for families affected by violence. At a remembrance ceremony held at Miami-Dade College on the 10th anniversary of the murders, Elena Sanchez stood before a gathering of nursing students, faculty, scholarship recipients, and community members. 10 years ago, a man decided to take my daughter's life to satisfy his curiosity, she said, her voice strong despite the decade of grief she had carried. But he did not take her spirit or her legacy. She gestured to the assembled scholarship recipients, many already working in hospitals throughout the region. Every patient these nurses care for, every life they touch, every family they comfort, this is Gabriella's true legacy. This is how we answer darkness with light. As the Miami sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks behind her, Elena concluded with words that resonated beyond the specific tragedy that had brought them together. The surveillance camera showed us how two precious lives ended, but it could not capture how many lives continue to be blessed because of who Gabriella and Carlos were, what they stood for, and how their memory inspires us to create a more compassionate world. The gathered crowd rose in a standing ovation, not just for her words, but for the resilience of the human spirit they represented, the capacity to transform even the darkest tragedy into a force for positive change in the world.